So, in this week's parsha, Parshas Vayishlach, we have an incident between Yaakov and an angel. And at the end of this incident, Yaakov is told that his name will no longer be Yaakov. His name will be changed from Yaakov to Yisroel. And the pasuk says, your name will no longer be called Yaakov, you will be called Yisroel.
So why do we not call him Yisroel now?
That's a good question.
Because like Abraham, we call him Abraham, not Avram.
Bingo. That's exactly where we're going.
Okay, great.
So we have a very similar pasuk as was just brought to our attention, that says about Avraham, oh, I just transgressed a biblical prohibition. And your name will no longer be Avram, your name will be Avraham, right? When Avram had the bris, his name was Avram, and his wife's name was Sarai. Each of them had the letter Hey added into their name. Avram became Avraham, Sarai became Sarah. And the pasuk says, your name will no longer be Avram, you will be called Avraham. What's interesting is that the Gemara says that anyone who calls Avraham by the name Avram, as opposed to Avraham, is transgressing a biblical prohibition. It is a biblical prohibition to refer to Avraham as Avram, because the pasuk says, you will no longer be called Avram. So anyone who calls Avraham Avram is transgressing that explicit, direct instruction in the pasuk that says, you will not be called Avram. So we are obligated to call him Avraham, not Avram.
So why does no one do it?
We do, hopefully. His name's Avraham.
But everyone says Avram. Avram Avinu, Avram Sarah.
It's a shortening, the same reason people say Yom Tov as opposed to Good Yom Tov, or Shabbos as opposed to Good Shabbos, or even Good Shabbos as opposed to Good Shabbos. You're saying it quickly, so it's Avram. But it's Avraham. But if someone intentionally says it without the Hey and refers to him as Avram as opposed to Avraham, that's a problem. We have the same, very similar pasuk this week with Yaakov, and it says, you will not be called Yaakov, you will be called Yisroel. Clearly, there's no scriptural prohibition to refer to Yisroel Avinu as Yaakov Avinu, which we all do. So why is it that when the pasuk says, you will not be called Avram, you will be called Avraham, we understand that that is a scriptural prohibition not to call Avraham Avram? But when it says you will not be called Yisroel, you will not be called Yaakov, you will be called Yisroel, all of a sudden we're like, no, that doesn't mean literally you're not allowed to be referred to as Yaakov. It just means your name is going to be changed to Yisroel. Why is it that with Yaakov we're interpreting or understanding it that way, but when it comes to Avraham Avinu, we're understanding that when it says you will not be called Avram, it means literally it is prohibited to refer to you as Avram? The answer to this question is quite simple, and that is, if you read in the Torah continues past this point and repeatedly continues to refer to him as Yaakov. So obviously, if the Torah, when the pasuk says, and you will not be called Yaakov, you will be called Yisroel, and then continues to refer to him with both names, primarily using the name Yaakov, the Torah is clearly indicating that you are allowed to call him Yaakov, because it continues to call him Yaakov. As opposed to Avraham Avinu, after the Torah says, you will not be called Avram, you will be called Avraham, he is never again referred to as Avram in the Torah, only Avraham. So we see very clearly the Torah lets us know when the statement, you will be called by your new name, you will not be called by your old name, the Torah lets us know in which case it means literally it is prohibited to refer to with your old name, and in which case it's maybe an elaborate way of just, making this statement that you have a new name. And the way that it tells us that is by using the names that it uses going forward. In one case it continues to use the old name, in one case it doesn't. That's our answer. That's fine. So now we understand how we know in which case you're allowed to and in which case you're not. But perhaps the more important question is why. Why is it that when Avram Avinu's name was changed, we were prohibited from referring to him with his previous name, but when Yaakov Avinu's name was changed, we were allowed to continue using the previous name? Right? Now, a name is more than just a functional word. It's not just a functional accessory, let's say, right? You have language. In any language, generally, we have different words to refer to different things, different nouns to refer to different objects, different verbs to refer to different actions, etc. Ouch. And it's just practical, right? If you want to be able to express something to someone, to communicate something, you need different words to refer to different things. If you want someone to know whether you're asking them to pass you a cup or a pencil, you need to have two different words, one for cup and one for pencil, because if you have the same word for both and you ask someone to pass you one, they're not going to know which one you want because it's the same word, obviously, right? We need different words for different things. It doesn't really matter what the word is. You just need different words. You need a range of words, each of which is specifically allocated to refer to a specific thing, whether it's an object, an action, a description, whatever it is. And if you have different words allocated to refer to different things, you can then communicate specifically, because each thing has a specific word. You use the word to refer to the thing you want to refer to. It doesn't really matter what the word is. And the proof of that is we have many, many dozens, hundreds of languages. I don't know how many hundreds, thousands maybe today, depending on how you classify, etc. We have many, many languages, all of which can be very effective for communication, and all of which use different words to refer to the same thing. So clearly, functionally, it doesn't really matter what word you use to refer to something, as long as you have a specific word. And what's interesting, I learned this recently, I didn't know this. I was speaking to someone about language recently, someone who studies languages, and they told me that English has apparently substantially, by a pretty big margin, the largest number of words out of any language. We have the most, and that makes it the most effective language for communication, because when you have a greater range of words, you can then be more specific in what you're referring to. You know, a lot of times when you translate, if you do a lot of translating between English and Hebrew, English and Yiddish, things like that, you'll notice, whether consciously or subconsciously, that a lot of times other languages can feel a little blunt relative to English, because we have sometimes a number of different words to refer to a number of different things that maybe a different language only has one word to refer to all of them. So the greater the range of words we have, the more specific we can be. But it doesn't matter what the word is. It just matters the variation and specificity in words gives us the ability to be specific in communication. So it's really arbitrary what word we use, right? If a cup were called a pencil and a pencil were called cup, it wouldn't make any difference except for the fact that we just swap the words. It doesn't matter. You could call anything anything, as long as we have clarity in which word refers to which thing, that's fine. We can use those words to communicate effectively regardless of what the word is, as long as we know what it is. This is not true for Lashon HaKodesh, for Hebrew. This is very different, because Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, is not just right. It's called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, the holy language. This is not a language that is just used for people to communicate. This is the language with which Hashem created reality. Hashem spoke the 10 utterances, and with these 10 utterances, he brought reality into being. He brought time, space, the universe into being. And he said, let there be light, and there was light, which means the Hebrew word for light, or, when Hashem said, let there be, or, and as a result of him speaking that, light came into being. That means the Hebrew word for light, or, is actually a conduit or an accessory for channeling of the specific divine creative force that makes visible electromagnetic radiation exist. The divine creative force that brings visible light into being is a force that is channeled and communicated by the Hebrew word Or, Aleph, Vav, Resh. So when Hashem said, let there be Or, the speaking of that word literally made the visible light exist. That's not arbitrary. The nature of the word itself actually is a vehicle for the divine creative force that makes it exist. Just deciding to use a different word instead, if Hashem had, so to speak, obviously this doesn't make sense on many levels, but if Hashem had decided, you know what, I feel like today I'm going to use a different word instead of that, without changing the nature of language and words, which obviously Hashem could do. But Hashem was just like, you know what, I'm in the mood, sometimes kids will play and they'll decide to be in the mood of swapping particular words, and they'll say, opposite game or whatever it is. If Hashem had just been like, I'm in the mood of using a different word, and said, let there be something else, and he was like, I'm going to use a different word for light, light would have come out very different, or it would have been something other than light, because the word itself is a vehicle. The structure of the word, the specific letters, the way the letters are combined, each letter is a vehicle to communicate and transmit a specific divine creative force. Letters combined into words make a specific complex divine creative force, a combination of divine creative forces, which becomes a complex product. And the thing that comes into being as a result of Hashem speaking that word is an outcome, or is the product of the divine creative forces that are represented by and transmitted and communicated by that word and that combination of letters. It's not arbitrary at all. Words make a big difference. So when Avraham's name changed from Avram to Avraham, that Hey was added. That name, and also just to tie this all together, Hashem renews creation every day, constantly. Hashem is constantly bringing the universe into existence. It's a continuous, the universe exists continuously. The universe used to not exist. The reason the universe came into being was because Hashem brought it into being with this divine creative force that makes it exist. But the natural state of affairs is a complete lack of existence of anything other than Hashem. When you make something exist in an unnatural state by applying force to bring that state into being, or to bring it into that unnatural state, if the state in which you're bringing something, is unnatural, you need to continuously apply that force. And as soon as you stop applying the force that makes something exist in an unnatural state, it's going to revert back to its natural state. Right? As long as this box of tissues is above the desk, the natural state, as a result of the box of tissues having mass and being pulled down by gravity towards the earth, is going to be that it's sitting on the desk. Right now, the tissue box is not sitting on the desk. Why? Because I am applying force with my body, with my arm, with my muscles and my bones and ligaments and tendons. I'm using all of those to take energy that I obtained from food I ate, convert that energy into a force that is pushing upwards and holding the box vertically upwards, or putting pressure inwards, which is holding it in place, depending on how specific we want to be. And the box is only going to stay up here as long as I am actively applying that force to hold the box there. And as soon as I stop applying the force, it's going to return back into what its natural state is at the moment above the desk, which is sitting on the desk. The natural state of everything is that Hashem exists, and that's it, period. Hashem brought the universe into being by speaking it into being, by using these utterances, words, to channel divine creative forces that brought the universe into being. But that's not a natural state. That existence is an outcome of Hashem applying a divine creative force to make it exist. If Hashem would stop applying that force to make it exist, it wouldn't exist anymore. There's this anecdote about people debating about if Hashem would, God forbid, decide to destroy, or decide that he doesn't want the world to exist anymore, what would he do? Well, he could burn it, but if he would burn it, there'd be ashes left and flood and all of these options, and every option has its reasons why it's not a perfect solution to destroying all of existence. But the whole conversation is really just absurd and moot because Hashem wouldn't need to destroy. Hashem could just stop bringing it into being, and then it just wouldn't be there anymore, right? It's like saying, well, what would be the best way for me to put this down on the desk? well, obviously there could be reasons why I might want to place it down gently instead of dropping it. But if someone say, what's the most effective way of me getting this from here to the desk? It's like, I don't actually have to get it from here to the desk. I just let go and it's going to be there by itself. I don't need to come up with a strategy to get it to the desk. It wants to be on the desk. I am applying a force that is compelling it or making it not be on the desk. Just stop applying the force. It'll go back. If Hashem would stop creating existence for an instant at any point in time, there'd be nothing. There'd be no time, no space, no universe, nothing. Hashem is constantly making things exist by continuously using these utterances and speaking these words, so to speak, kaviyachol, as a vehicle for the constant application of these divine creative forces that make each particular thing exist. So the name, when Abraham's name became Avram as opposed to what it used to be before, which had been Avram, there's a change in the structure of his name. There's a change in the structure of, or in the divine creative force that was responsible, that was his name, i.e. the word that referred to him, i.e. the vehicle for the divine creative force that made him exist. The vehicle changed from a vehicle represented by and illustrated with the letters Aleph, Vase, Resh, Mem, to the vehicle represented by and illustrated by the letters Aleph, Vase, Resh, Hey, Mem. New vehicle, new complete divine creative force, different person, different product. Now, for some reason, the person that's represented by the name Avraham, as opposed to the person that is brought into being and represented by the name Avram, when we compare those two, Avram, once this upgrade happened, whatever Avram meant is gone. Now he's Avraham. And whatever it is that Avram referred to as opposed to what Avraham referred to is something that's in the history basket, and we don't use that name anymore. And we could get into that, but I think it'd be a better use of time to focus on that other part of the picture, which is Yaakov. So for some reason, right, we have this big change from Yaakov to Yisroel. Whoever and whatever it is that's brought into being by the divine creative force represented by the word Yaakov, that's different to the person brought into being by the divine creative force represented by Yisroel. Yisroel, the person referred to by Yisroel, clearly is an upgrade relative to the person represented by Yaakov, right? Because that's what happened here. He overcame the angel and was told, well, now you overcame this challenge, your name will be changed from Yaakov to Yisroel. This was an upgrade. But for some reason, whatever it was that Yaakov had been, which had been represented by the name Yaakov, is still something that we want to associate with him and to keep a part of his picture, even after he got this upgrade to be referred to as Yisroel. So now both names, Yaakov and Yisroel, are used to refer to this person, which means that whatever it is that's represented and communicated by the name Yaakov still has a place, even though the personality, etc., that's represented by the name Yisroel is an upgrade relative to that. Both of them still have a place here. Does that make sense? So now the question is, what are they? What is this personality, that's represented by Yaakov? What is this person that's represented by Yisroel? The person, the mission, the relationship with reality, etc. Yaakov refers to one, Yisroel refers to the other. And apparently they both have a place still today, which is why we can use both names to refer to him. And we are referred to as Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Yisrael, the sons of this person, which means that, right, this is what, we're not referred to generally as Bnei Avram, Bnei Yitzchak. We are, the Jewish people, we are all the offspring of Avram, and we are all the offspring of Yitzchak, no less than we are the offspring of Yaakov. We are referred to, though, as Bnei Yisrael. That's the name that the Torah uses primarily to refer to us as people, which means there's something about that person, Yisrael, Yaakov, that is core to our identity and who we are and why we're here. And that means that when the Torah tells us, despite the fact that his name was changed from Yaakov to Yisroel, upgraded from Yaakov to Yisroel, both names are still applicable because both of these messages, both of these phenomena are still a part of Yaakov's story. That means that both of these approaches to life, both of these relationships with reality and with Hashem that are represented by the two names Yaakov and Yisroel are both going to be important to us and to our individual journeys as sons of, progeny of Yaakov / Yisroel. So the question is, what are they? We'll come at it from a couple of angles and will hopefully, but the primary distinction here that we're going to get into is that Yaakov, one of the things that is represented by the name Yaakov, Akev means heel. It can also mean to confound, to confuse. Yaakov got his blessings and, everything, his legacy, etc., from Yitzchak, officially through deceit. Ba'akva, through deceit, through misleading, through causing confusion. Right? He tricked Yitzchak into giving him the blessings. Now, technically speaking, did he deserve the blessings? Yes, he did. Esau had sold them to him for a pot of soup. But the bottom line is, the process by means of which he got them was deceptive. It was misleading. He confused and misled Yitzchak into giving him the blessings. And to giving him everything that he got from Yitzchak through those blessings. So that's what's represented by the name Yaakov. Deceiving, misleading, tricking. As opposed to Yisroel, which can be broken down, the name can be broken down a couple of ways. Li Rosh Sar Kel. Sar Kel means a prince of God, a minister of God, a representative of God, representing someone who is direct, clear, comes to represent what they represent, who they represent, they stand for something. And generally, if someone is a minister for someone, a representative for someone, part of their representation or part of them doing their job is that it's understood who they represent and what they represent, which is how they're able to behave as a representative. So the name Yisroel represents doing what we're here to do, living our life in a direct, clear, open, transparent way, as opposed to tricking and deceiving. Now, if we want to break that down a little and talk about perhaps what that means a little more deeply, one of the big differences. Now, this is not what the difference is. This is a difference in the person and in the mindset beneath the surface, behind the scenes between these two.
If Yaakov, that name was given to him by his parents before he did anything, so how can we say that it's, tricky and misleading if, I don't know.
Okay, good. That's a good question. It's a very practical question. You're coming up from a very practical angle. Keep in mind, there are a number of parts to this. One is that when parents give a name, there's a degree of divine providence, right? Ruach HaKodesh. Also, when we look at things with the understanding that obviously the reality as Hashem sees it is far more complex than the reality the way we see it, right? Hashem can coordinate things and bring things together in ways that don't seem to us to make sense, that seem to be unrealistic or impossible, or right? Because we have a very limited view of reality. And we perceive and understand things based on the parameters of, or the axioms with which we define existence or perceive it. Hashem's looking at things from, infinite perspective, and there are no defining axioms that determine how things work for Hashem. So Hashem could bring multiple things together, and then it plays out that way. The name was given by his parents. It just so happens to be that name carries this message.
Right. Also, the way that you're describing Yisroel, you used words like clear, direct, transparent, whereas even since the conception of Yaakov and Esau, there was it was like up for debate, like who was conceived first, who came out first, birth rate, like it wasn't clear, direct, or transparent. It was always like a little jumbled.
Right, and he was referred to as Yaakov at that point. Right, exactly. And in the birth itself, that's emphasized with the fact that, he was holding on to the heel, which is like it's in the name, it's in the process of birth, exactly.
And wait, do you think he got his name changed after he was married and his children?
Yeah.
So
the children all happened already, and now on his way back to Esav.
So all the Shvatim were born with the name Yaakov after Yisroel.
Yes. They were Bnei Yaakov at that point, correct. Question?
Yeah. So why are we using? Sorry, just to clarify, the word deception, right? So what about that word, or is there other words that can be synonymous to that also are attached to Yaakov, or what is it about the deception? It's just pretending to be something it's not,
Okay, so that's exactly where are you asking what's positive about that? Why is that a value that we would want to retain? Right, so that's exactly where we're going now. So if we look at, deception is what it is. Transparency, openness, directness is what it is. If we look beneath the surface at what would make a person engage in deception, trickery, as opposed to, the mindset, an approach that would make a person just be transparent, direct, and open. And we could represent these in many different ways. We could represent them in ways that make each one look positive and negative. But neither of them is inherently positive or negative. As with many things, it's a matter of application. Either one to the extreme is, might be negative, and depending on how we apply them. But we can look at it as, or what's happening beneath the surface, if we want to really divide them, is, one of the ways we could do this is looking at it as doing things on one's own terms versus prioritizing the terms of the terms of the one that we're dealing with, the person, the organization, the individual, the entity that one is dealing with. Right? When one takes the entity that they're dealing with into account and prioritizes the terms of the person, let's say the person they're talking to, the person they're dealing with, negotiating with, whatever it is, they're going to always be thinking about how does that person see it? What's that person's experience? What's that person's perception? And this is not inherently either good or bad. There are positive variations of this and negative variations of this, right? And sometimes the difference between them isn't so black and white, isn't so distinct. It's not just necessarily a big fat line that you just cross from one to the other. Let's say, for example, when you're talking to someone, if you're communicating to someone, especially, let's say, about something personal, about something sensitive that's important to them, it's very, very important to think not just about the message we want to communicate, right? Let's say someone's talking to us, someone talking to you, to me, whoever it is, and they're struggling with some personal thing, and you want to help them, and you clarify and you realize, okay, so I see where they're coming from, I see what's their cognitive distortion or the mistake that's leading them to perceive things in a way that's resulting in them having a negative experience, having a hard time. And I see how they could adjust their perspective or look at things differently that's going to make things better for them. That's not all we need to figure out, because if a person figures that out and then just dumps it on the person, depending on how it's communicated, it might make things worse instead of better. Right? Part of what we need to do, why is it that we're trying to figure out, okay, how do they deceive it? Is there a cognitive distortion? Is there something wrong with their perspective that's resulting in them experiencing things this way? Why are we interested in that? Because we are trying to improve that person's experience, make that person's experience be more positive. We're considering the factors that are contributing to them experiencing things the way that they're experiencing it, in the interest of hoping to then be able to figure out how to make changes that will improve their experience. A big part of that is going to be considering how we communicate it. You could communicate something that's objectively true and in the person's best interests to understand and to adopt and to integrate, but if you communicate it in a way that is going to either, number one, if you're communicating it to a 5-year-old with language that a person needs to be 30 to appreciate, it's not going to be effective. If you're communicating it to someone who's sensitive to particular things and you don't consider the language you use or the tone of voice and etc., the way that you can communicate something that's true and helpful, but if the way in which we communicate it isn't appropriate, isn't sensitive, we still might not have the same effect, right? So what we're doing is considering on that person's terms and saying, okay, I'm thinking about this person, how they perceive things, what their priorities are, what their sensitivities are. I'm taking those things into account in crafting my message. Now, why is that not manipulation? I'm choosing the words that I use to communicate in the interest of making sure that the person perceives them a particular way to generate an outcome that I want to generate in the person. The only reason that's not manipulation is because we're doing it with that person's best interests in heart and we're trying to help them. Right? But it's the exact same process that a person will use in selecting the words, trying to select words to create a particular outcome in their own best interest at the other person's expense. It's the exact same thing. I'm trying to figure out how to achieve the outcome that I am attempting to achieve with this person by considering that person and by operating on their terms. I want to make this change in this person's perspective and experience, so I'm operating on their terms. I'm using the language based on the effect that it's going to have on them, regardless of what it means to me. The only reason that in one case we're calling it manipulation and in one case we're not is because manipulation generally is used negatively to refer to negative things, taking advantage, etc. But ultimately, they're both manipulating, right? We're trying to manipulate a person to help them. We're using careful choice of words, etc., to change a person's perspective and behavior in the interest of improving their quality of life. So we call that helping, not manipulating. But technically speaking, they're both cases of manipulation. It's a question of, is it for our interest at their expense or is it for their interest? Right? But in both cases, we're working on the person's terms. We're working on their terms. So working on someone's terms and taking them into account and their experience and perspective and sensitivities into account inherently is neither negative or positive. It is what it is. It's just a question of, are we operating on their terms or not? Question?
Just like to clarify, like, can we think of deception in Yaakov, like with that idea as like a bridge? Like deception is a bridge. Like,
Between
like, I don't know, something that's outside or other and like the inner like good that he's trying to seek or trying to bring out in things?
That's exactly where we're going.
Okay.
Yes. So, right, that's Yaakov. When someone is trying to deceive, right, when you try to trick someone, the reason you bother trying to trick someone is because you want to operate on their terms. You want to take them into account, right? And then you have people, the expression in Yiddish is tefeifon. It's just like, well, you have people that take a very different approach to getting what they want, right? Some people will get what they want by manipulating, by using language and different things by taking the particulars of the individual into account and thinking about the perspective and their sensitivities, etc., and then crafting a message or communication to generate the outcome that they want. And you'll have someone else who's just like, I don't care. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to do what I need to do to get my thing. I couldn't care less what anyone else thinks. That's the situation, right? And in such a case, a person doesn't need to bother to try to deceive or anything else. It's just like transparency. Yes, I don't care about you. I care about me. I'm going to do what I need to do to get what I want. If you're in the way, I'll steamroll you. That's transparent. Right? Now, transparency, again, can go both ways. Transparency in and of itself is neither positive or negative. A person can be doing something positive and be transparent about it. A person could do something negative and be transparent about it. Transparency can be positive or negative, right? If, let's say, someone is struggling and they're having a hard time, and you see very clearly what it is about their perspective their perception, that's causing them to have these negative emotions and causing their experience to be difficult, and you have clarity in the changes in their perspective, perception, cognition that will improve their experience and make their quality of life better, sometimes if you just lay that out transparently, you might make things a whole lot worse. Right? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's not inherent either one or the other. Sometimes it's very important, especially when a person's, having a hard time. There is an increased likelihood that there's a tendency to be paranoid, to be critical, to not be as open and accepting. And sometimes, in the interest of helping the person, it might be very important to not be too transparent and to be very careful and selective in how we say things and how much we let on, in the interest of helping that person get to a point where hopefully one day, sometimes a person will get there and sometimes they won't, hopefully a person gets to a point where, things are figured out and, they're in a good place, and then they can look back and say, oh, I see what you did. Right? And now they see everything retrospectively with transparency and appreciate it. Had they appreciated that with transparency and understood at the time with transparency, they may never have gotten to this place because they wouldn't have taken it positively. Right? So both operating on someone's terms as opposed to our own versus being transparent, gay pfeifen, do things your way, don't operate on their terms. Both of those can be positive or negative. It depends. Right? It depends on the situation, on the application, on the variation. Neither of them is inherently positive or negative. Right? And these are what are represented by Yaakov. When Yaakov got these brachas, for example, from Yitzchak, he didn't do anything wrong. He had purchased, literally, he had engaged in a transaction by means of which he purchased the right to those blessings. Now, for whatever reason, he didn't want to hurt Yitzchak, and to tell Yitzchak, for Yitzchak to have been made consciously aware of the fact that his son, Esav, who he thought so highly of, had sold his birthright for a pot of soup, he'd have been heartbroken. It would have actually broken his heart. And so Yaakov said, my father's state of mind is important to me, so I'm going to be operating on his terms. I'm going to figure out a way to make this happen by taking him and his perspective and his experience and priorities and values into account. I'm going to deceive him as necessary to create the desired outcome, even though the desired outcome was one that he deserved. As opposed to, right, so that was Yaakov being trickery, that was Yaakov. And this is an approach, and ultimately we are all here with an objective. We are all here to achieve something. The same way that Yaakov was. And broadly speaking, our objective is the same as his was, right? As we talked about last week at length. Every one of us is here to make a mark on the world, to integrate divinity into the world, to make the world into a dwelling place for Hashem, to uplift the world, to unite matter and spirit, all of the above. Now, could be multiple approaches. So ultimately what we're doing is, right, we're trying to achieve an outcome in the world around us, in the natural material world. And that outcome is to integrate divinity into it. Now, one approach to doing that could be operating on the world's terms, taking the world's terms into account and being calculated about, okay, how are we going to achieve the outcome that we want on the world's terms, taking the world's nature, priorities, characteristics, values into account, and then working with that and through that to get it to the place we want to bring it to. That's Yaakov. That's working on its terms, which is in this category of deceit, misleading. Right? And coming back, maybe bringing an example that's closer to this. Even right in business or in a transaction, generally, you would think, if someone would say, is being misleading or deceptive in business positive or negative? It's like, well, of course that's negative. Well, it's like, maybe. But what about if you're engaging in a transaction with someone that's in their best interests, but they don't appreciate, they don't understand how? Maybe you have a much broader, bigger view of the world of business or whatever it is, and from where that person's coming from and their experience, they have no concept of how much they stand to gain by this transaction, and they're afraid of it and they're nervous, and so they don't want to do it, and they're just like, I don't see the value in this, it doesn't justify the effort, I'm not going to bother. But you realize that if they would just engage in this transaction and do it, their world will open up, it'll be amazing for them. They just don't appreciate it, or they're too scared, or whatever it is. And then you mislead that person, or you work on their terms and carefully select your language, etc., and deceive, in a sense, the person into engaging in that transaction with you, which is mutually beneficial. And maybe, and just to clarify that, because it can feel like, well, yeah, ultimately it's, that might just be that, I have something to gain, and I'm convincing myself it's in their best interest. It's like they don't have to if they don't want to. Let's say that I can engage in this transaction with 3 different people. I have the option, and I'm going to make the same upside no matter who I engage in this transaction with, but there's a particular person who's maybe a good friend or a relative, and I want to engage in the transaction with them because I know that they're also going to benefit out of this, and they're scared, they're nervous, they don't realize how beneficial it'll be for them, and so I mislead, I deceive, I work on their terms, and I calculate my language based on their perspective and their experience and their sensitivities and values and priorities to communicate things in a way that's going to, manipulate them into engaging in this transaction with me, because I know how much they're going to benefit. Because I could get the same benefit by engaging with someone else in the transaction. I know it's going to be very mutually beneficial, and I want the benefit for them. So even in business, I have now been somewhat, let's say, misleading or deceptive in business. Now, obviously, lying is a problem. I'm not talking about lying, but, working on their terms and carefully crafting the message to generate that outcome. And I've done it for their best interest. There's nothing wrong with that. That was all positive. I didn't lie. I wasn't dishonest. I engaged in a mutual transaction that the person agreed to. Yeah, I kind of manipulated them into it, but I did it for their benefit. So even manipulating or deceiving to a degree, assuming we can deceive without lying or transgressing any prohibitions, any halachas, that deceiving someone in business might be a noble and good thing. We are here to do something that is good for the world. And a big part of doing that is operating on the world's terms. Right? Living on the world's terms. Engaging, living a lifestyle that is reasonable and responsible in terms of taking care of our health, taking care of our well-being, generating the income that we need for ourselves, for whoever is, we're responsible to take care of. Have all of these things, having a job, supporting ourselves, taking care of our health, these are all things we're doing on the world's terms. If Hashem had created the world in a way in which we don't need to, work to generate income, we wouldn't need to. If Hashem created the world in a way in which we didn't need to eat well, sleep well, and exercise well in order to have the best health, we wouldn't need to. The reason we do those things is because we're operating on the world's terms. We're operating on the world's terms to generate the outcome that we want. That's Yaakov. And that's a big part of what we're here to do. Now, Yisroel, transparency is, I'm operating on Hashem's terms, on Torah's terms, on the Neshama's terms. I don't take any of that into account. I'm not bothered with any of that. Both of these approaches have a role. Now, an example of where we would see the second approach, because it sounds like the Yaakov actually is, in a sense, maybe sounds like the right one, and the Yisroel sounds irresponsible. One example would be Shabbos. Right? Let's say that there's a food that I really like, I really enjoy eating. For me to eat that food during the week in the service of Hashem, purely in the service of Hashem, or in order for me to eat that food during the week and for that to be purely a contribution towards Dir B'Tachtonim, a positive thing spiritually, I need to be eating it with the intent of serving Hashem. Now, there might be variations of that. I might be eating it because I know this is nutritious. It's going to give me the macro and micronutrients, the calories, the vitamins, the minerals, whatever it is, or particular ones within those sets that I need to be able to serve Hashem to the best degree, to be healthy, etc. Maybe I'm a person who is doing my best to serve Hashem, and I'm spread a bit thin. I'm a bit worn out. I know I need to take care of myself to get myself back into a positive, productive mindset. Maybe I need to have some rest. I need to eat some food that I'm going to enjoy because I know that's going to help me be more functional. Those are both ways of eating that food. in the service of Hashem, purely. Can we delude ourselves? Yeah, that's also a possibility. But doing those things the way that I've described them would both be ways of eating that food that I enjoy, 100% in the service of Hashem, and I have now operated on the world's terms because I did that because I need to eat to get calories, to get nutrients, or to feel better so I can do what I need to do. So I've operated on the world's terms, and I've tricked the world and this tasty food into becoming part of a dwelling place for Hashem. I've tricked the food into having divinity integrated into it by operating on its terms to generate the outcome that I want. Eating tasty food on Shabbos is a mitzvah, period. There's a mitzvah to enjoy Shabbos. One of the ways to do that in halacha is to eat tasty food. A person can eat tasty food on Shabbos just because it tastes good and I want to eat this tasty food because I am going to get sensory pleasure by eating this food. Boom, mitzvah. Serving Hashem. There's no, what are the world's terms? I'm going to find a way to channel divinity into this food. This is not the food's terms. I'm not taking the food's terms into account. I am transparent. I'm doing this my way. I'm eating the food because I want to. And by doing that, boom, I'm making it into a dirba tachtonim. I'm integrating divinity into it. Is that a superior approach? Is it conceptually more effective if we were able to always just do whatever we want and just channel divinity? Boom. Yes. No need to consider the world's terms and take things into account and figure out how to make things work and to do things in the right... None of that. Just boom. You do things, you just channel divinity, channel divinity, channel divinity. Unite, bring together matter and spirit. Boom. Make everything into a resting, dwelling place for Hashem. Is it superior? Yes, it's superior. But the fact that that's conceptually superior, or maybe even effectively superior to the degree that it's an option, that's not the main thing that we're here to do. And very simply, look at how many weekdays there are in our week and how many Shabbos days there are in a week. We have 6 weekdays, 1 day of Shabbos. Clearly, operating on weekday terms, on Shabbos, we don't go to work. We don't engage in all of those things operating on the world's terms. We're operating on spiritual terms. We're davening, we're learning Torah, we're spending time with family, doing meaningful things, doing uplifting things, enjoying food and making it, elevating the food just by enjoying it. It's just open, direct, transparent. No taking the world's terms into account. But that's only 1 day a week, 6 days a week, the vast majority of the week, the overwhelming majority of the week. We are here to be Yaakov as opposed to Yisroel. To take the world's values and priorities and nature and sensitivities, etc., into account, to work on those terms, and to live a life in which we're interacting with the world on the world's terms. Now, on the world's terms doesn't mean on the world's terms against Torah, obviously. But it means living a Torah true life on the world's terms. And by living a Torah true life on the world's terms, we're manipulating the world quite simply. We are taking its terms, nature, priorities, value, sensitivities into account and finding a way to work with those to generate the outcome we want, i.e. we are manipulating the world into the outcome that we want. Despite that is conceptually inferior to Yisroel, transparent, open, steamroll, boom, just do it without needing to take anything into account and operate on the world's terms. That's not the main thing we're here to do. The main thing we're here to do is the Yaakov approach, operating with the world on its terms, misleading as necessary, manipulating, so to speak, as necessary. And that's why even though at that point Yaakov's name was upgraded to Yisroel, it was like, you don't need to work on the world's terms anymore. You've gotten to a point where you can just be open, transparent, steamroll, and just boom, and go do it, just boom, divinity into the world. You've gotten to a point where you're not required to operate on the world's terms in order to generate the outcome. But that doesn't mean that's obsolete. It doesn't mean, boom, just go the Yisroel path all the way. Because there's a depth and complexity of integration when it's done on the world's terms that is not there when it's done, when it's steamrolled, when it's just... You might achieve the outcome right? But when you achieve the outcome, Hashem wants us to make, the Midrash says, a dira betachtonim, a dwelling place for Hashem in tachtonim. In tachtonim, in the material world, doesn't just mean geographically in the material world, because Hashem is already in the material world. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Famous song, we all know. That's not what it means. It means in the fabric of the world. And when we integrate divinity in the world on the world's terms, by taking the nature of the world into account and working that way, we've integrated divinity into the world by means of worldly processes. On the world's terms, that depth and complexity of integration is far greater than when it's just blasted and steamrolled. And so Hashem says, yes, your name is getting upgraded from Yaakov to Yisroel. You're no longer limited to needing to work on the terms of the world anymore. You can just go blast, you can do Shabbos, you can just, boom, transparent, blast divinity and do the job. And there's a time and a place for that, and we all do that every Shabbos. But the fact that his name was upgraded from Yaakov to Yisroel because he was no longer limited to needing to work on the world's terms, that doesn't mean that operating on the world's terms is no longer a thing, that it no longer has a place. It does. And that's why the Torah continues to refer to him as Yaakov. And in doing so, it lets us know that we can also continue to use the name Yaakov. Because the upgrade from Yaakov to Yisroel is not that Yaakov was replaced with Yisroel. It's the limitation of needing to work with the Yaakov approach was removed, and he was now able to act and to interact with the world with the Yisroel approach. But that doesn't mean that the Yaakov approach is history or obsolete. They both have a time and a place and a role. And as a matter of fact, Yaakov, we still refer to Yaakov, the Torah refers to him much more as Yaakov than Yisroel, even after his name was changed, which is reflected, or which reflects the fact that in our lives today, as the Bnei Yisroel, the sons of Yisroel, the sons of Yaakov, the tribe of Yaakov, of Yisroel, most of what we do is generally supposed to be with the Yaakov approach. First and foremost, mostly, we try to do things in a way that is on the world's terms, respects the world, is responsible, is natural, is normal, is reasonable. There's a time and a place to say gay fife, and there's a time and a place to say no. If sometimes that time and place is when the values or the terms of the world are against Torah, and then we say no, sorry, too bad. And sometimes it might be something like Shabbos, for example, whatever it is. Yes, there's a time and a place for that. We're not limited to needing to work on the world's terms. And if we have to break that and to be transparent and steamroll, then that's what we have to do. But most of the time, it's the better approach to work on the world's terms when that makes sense and when it works. Because when we do that, the depth and complexity of integration of divinity into the world is far greater.
Can this be tied into the reason why, at Matan Torah, Hashem said first speak to the house of Yaakov and then Bnei Yisrael, the women were Yaakov and the men were Israel, right? Am I saying that right?
Yes. Yeah, likely is. Now that you mention it, I think I might have actually seen sort of the crossover between the two. I'm not sure though off the top of my head, but for sure that makes sense and it all adds up. 100%, yes.
I know that you intentionally didn't go here, but why is Avram history and Abraham?
Well, I didn't intentionally not go there because I wanted to avoid it. Thank you. I intentionally didn't go there just because if I had gotten carried away into that, we wouldn't have had time for this at all.
Sure.
If you want to be super brief, is the next teacher outside? No. To be super brief, Avram is, you could come in if you want. Av, father, patriarch. Ram means elevated, high up, right? Avram was this patriarch, this channel of divine wisdom from very high up that was defined by his exaltedness and high upness and connection to, very high divinity and whatever we want to call it. The hay being added in, and he became Avraham. Part of what's communicated by that is the combination of the hay and the mem. Av, patriarch, That's short for Hamon. An abbreviation of Hamon means the multitudes. Av Hamon Goyim. Your name will be Avraham ki Av Hamon Goyim Nesaticha. I have made you the patriarch of the multitude of nations. Which again, we have a similar question. Well, he got upgraded. He had a bris milah. He removed this, this covering so that divinity could be channeled openly. So now, in doing so, he went from being this exalted patriarch to being a patriarch of everyone. Like, that seems a little counterintuitive. And the truth is, it's not. Right? When someone, if you can communicate, let's say, an idea in physics to people who, all of whom have PhDs in different fields of physics, and you can't communicate that idea to a 9th grade student, that's not because you have such a good grasp that you can only communicate to PhDs and not 9th grade students. The person who has a real solid grasp will be able to communicate it to PhDs, people with PhDs as appropriate, and to the 9th grade student as appropriate. So what happened here is that Avram went from being almost stuck and limited to how exalted he was and how high up he was, to now being so plugged into something that's so large, it's not limited to only being large, and it's able to come down all the way. And now he was able to be a patriarch and to be a source of inspiration and divinity for all the multitudes, for anyone. There was no one that was not sufficiently advanced for Avram to connect. The same way that if someone really, really knows the material, there's no one they won't be able to communicate it to if they just take the time to think about how to break it down and to change the language, etc. You're welcome.